Hi, in this Q&A, I'm going to answer questions from the members of this channel and from the Patreons that I have received so far. So let's head right into it. Item 6931 asks the real big picture of the geopolitical factors that will determine if Ukraine wins or loses, your gut feeling in which way things are heading, and the end result. Also, your thoughts about what the West did right and wrong, whether the West ever has a future if it can't work together. Things like this. Okay, so the big picture in geopolitical factors which will determine if the Ukraine will win will be the election in Germany and how Trump decides to handle it. Now, we all know that a lot of Ukraine supporters are probably not siding with the Republicans and expect Trump to abandon them. And that's absolutely a possibility. Let's not question that. But at the same time, Trump has shown in the past that he's willing to go to extreme measures to assert his position. Let's remember the killing of Qasem Soleimani, or let's remember that he supposedly wanted to kill Bashar al-Assad, the dictator of Syria, after he had used chemical weapons against his nation. So when it comes to this, obviously there will be those two nations that play the biggest role, because they not just can do a lot themselves, but they can also influence the others and put pressure on other nations if they want to do so. And they have the economic and the military capacity and production capacity to influence the war in Ukraine in the regard that Ukraine can still prevail in this regard. So we'll have to see what Trump decides. I would guess if Trump delivers ATACMS, they will come without restrictions. The question with Trump will be, will he deliver ATACMS? But I cannot imagine that Trump will continue this farce that Ukraine will get weapons but is being told what to attack with us. I do not see this in the picture if Trump comes, but I might obviously be wrong. What are my gut feelings, the which way things are heading, and the end result? The problem is that 2.5 years were wasted by Biden and Scholz. They prevented a Ukrainian defeat, which otherwise would have probably happened in 2022. But they also prevented a Ukrainian victory by being hesitant. Now, most of you do not know me from my German channel, but there it was roughly May 2022, May, June, the moment it was clear that the war will last longer, with Kiev not being taken. I said that now we need to think the long term. We need to start training their pilots. We need to deliver them tanks. We need to start production to help the Ukrainians. And obviously this has not happened because the political will was not there. The will to tell the voters that this is necessary, that it is necessary to, in quotation mark, waste this taxpayer money to progress in this regard, and this has not happened. Now the Russians have turned over to war economy. The mobilization so far, the troop generation on the Russian side is increasingly running into problems. That could be a good side for Ukraine, but on the Ukrainian side, on the other side, the morale is at the bottom, is rock bottom, because of the defeats in the long run, because of the feeling of inferiority. If we compare this to the feeling after the liberation of Kherson, for instance, they are worlds apart in the morale right now. The West would have to go gigantic steps to change this. Ukraine could theoretically still mobilize 1 million men, but you have to tell the Ukrainians why to do it, and you have to pay them for this because the government will not be able to finance it. So unless the West pays for those soldiers, that Ukraine can actually give them their wage, the 3,500 euros. So I think they're getting close to $4,000 a month. And before they're paying taxes, right now they're paying taxes, then they are receiving 4,000. The West would have to give Ukraine the money. They can't afford it themselves, and it would have to give them the weaponry and the ammunition, so those soldiers don't feel like they're being they are sheep walking towards slaughter, but they are getting the arms, the weapons to defeat the Russians. And we are far away from this, and this seems to be highly unlikely. So in my mind, it's heading to a Ukrainian defeat. I do not see Ukraine regain its borders from 1991. I think we are past that point clearly now, where it is realistic for Ukraine to regain this in the near future. And the moment the front line stops, to whatever degree, if we are optimistic and believe the Pompeo plan, I know Pompeo is no longer in the picture, but if we believe his plan to become reality or just a freezing of the front line, it is clear that this will allow the Russians to complete the Russification of the areas they have occupied, or that they keep occupying after this. So those parts will be lost forever. And this alone is a defeat already, as Ukraine after that will be smaller than it is before. To which degree the defeat that Ukraine will suffer will obviously matter, though. We see the historic example of Finland. Finland lost 2 wars in a row against Moscow. And nowadays they are in NATO, they are in EU, they are liberal, they are a free country, democratic country. They have survived being defeated twice. They lost their second biggest city with Viipuri, today's Viborg. The Finnish population there had to flee from the Russians. They lost their defendable borders. They suffered dearly in those 2 wars against the Russians, but they survived. And after some time of Finlandization, where they had to adjust their foreign policy to not anger Moscow, now they are fully inside of the West, fully part of the West, and they are safe as they are part of NATO. So Ukraine can still have a future, and it can survive the war like Finland did the Winter War, with losses in territory and losses in men. But it's far from certain that this can be achieved, and this will still take a lot of Western aid. But to be perfectly honest, while I want Ukraine to win this war, while I want Ukraine to go back to its 1991 borders, for reasons of it being just and for reasons of it being important in geopolitical terms, I do not see this happening in any time, in any realistic scenario, even though we can construct a theoretic scenario where it's still possible. But theoretically doesn't mean it's going to turn into reality. Also, your thoughts about what the West did right and wrong. I think I mentioned that far 8 too hesitant and too late, and especially before the war, no red lines. West only drew itself red lines. There would have been an easy way to help Ukraine by surprising Russia to a certain degree. For instance, the Ukrainians and the Western populations were asking for a no-fly zone at the beginning of the war. This would have meant that NATO planes have to shoot down Russian planes, have to engage Russian air defenses. This would have very likely led to an increased escalation and probably to World War III. But the West could have done that 2 weeks before the beginning of the war, after the invitation of the Ukrainians. They could have started patrolling Ukrainian sky, and this would have led the Russians to decide whether or not they want to enter Ukraine while NATO planes are patrolling around us. This could have been this could have led to hesitation. Then we know that Western leaders knew beforehand that Russia wants to invade, and I do not see there was any serious threat in this regard. Just imagine the German government, for instance, talking to the opposition. This seems to be, like I quote now, a fictional quote, this seems to be a real threat that the Russians might start a war inside of Europe, a war of conquest. We need to get together and make a fund, a law that would give Ukraine 500 billion in weapons that they can order from Germany in case the Russians attack. If the German chancellor goes with this to Moscow and says it's in law, it's going to be automatic. If you do this, the Ukrainians will be able to order whatever they want and how much they want, and the German state will pay for this with taxes. Now imagine other nations doing the same. This could have had a deterrent effect. In the end, we do not know. We see that the mistake was done to not take Russia serious enough, and when the threat was looming, then the threats towards Russia were not serious enough, were not strong enough to deter Russia in this. So the West failed in its deterrence. It failed earlier in understanding that Russia will probably fight about Ukraine. I would not say, like others, like Mearsheimer said, for instance, that it's the West fault by NATO expansion. Everyone has the right to apply to NATO, and Ukraine is a sovereign country. But what the West should have done is understand that this might lead to a military conflict, and then either make sure that Ukraine can defend itself in a case like this, or protect Ukraine, like for instance giving a unilateral security guarantee that is enforced by military until Ukraine has joined NATO or already sent troops there, something like this at this point. Or they could have just said, no, sorry, Ukraine, we are not going to fight for you to be allowed inside of NATO, and the Russians are probably going to attack you. So while we agree that you would be fine inside of NATO, and while we would welcome you in here, we are not going to fight about it, so forget about it. But giving Ukraine the chance to join, and everyone seriously knew that the Russians should probably be unhappy about this. Again, this is like blaming the girl in the park for the short skirt. If we say this was the West's fault or the Ukraine's fault, Russia is still the aggressor, even if Ukraine is a provocation, Ukraine joining NATO or something like this. This doesn't change who the aggressor is. But we could have done it different in the West by acknowledging the danger and adjusting our policy, either in protecting Ukraine before it gets invaded, or by simply acknowledging that we are not willing to do that and give up Ukraine and tell them, sorry, that's too much of a risk for us. Like today, most in the West acknowledges that Taiwan is a democratic country that has solid rule of law and that it's an independent country. We don't acknowledge this publicly because we do not have the balls to accept that the war then breaks out between China and Taiwan, as China declares has a law that would require military force to stop Taiwan, and we are not willing to defend Taiwan. So we are honest and say we act like it's still the one China policy and so on and so forth. There we do the necessary things. With Ukraine, we haven't done this. The West even has a future. This will all depend on us and on our nations. The West is challenged in wide regards, but I think there I would like to quote Kemal Mustafa Ataturk, who was the founder of modern Turkey, who said there are many cultures, but only one civilization, the Western. And I think if we look in the world, there's only one place where the wide variety of liberties have appeared. The combination of those. Now, you have other countries that ended slavery, like the West did, with the northern states fighting against their own brothers in the South, in the US, like with the British, who used their own military to force other nations to stop slavery, basically committing acts of piracy and acts of war against neutral nations just to free slaves. All of this was done in the West. Other nations liberated slaves as well. Other nations have also liberated women and given them equal rights. Other nations have respect for the property laws, all of this. But the combination of freedom of religion, freedom of equal rights for women, freedom for minorities, all of this has only developed in the West. And I think this is the best place in the world, the Western world. And we all will have to fight for it. We have division within. And some developments are probably detrimental to this. Wherever you are on the political spectrum, you will probably interpret this different than I do or than the next viewer does. But in total, I think the West is the best place in the world, and we all should try to preserve it as this and fight together to keep it at this. These were answers on questions I have received by channel members here on YouTube or on Patreon. I will try to keep doing this in the future for supporters of both sides. If you also want a question, please consider supporting the channel. It really helps and it is a nice sign of appreciation. I cannot promise to answer every single question simply because of matters of time, and there might be questions I can't answer, etc. But I'll try to come back to you, and thank you for your support that is being provided by you. So thank you so much. And if you're new here, I would like to invite you to subscribe to the channel and hit the bell icon. Leave a comment about the things I said and give it a thumbs up if you liked it. And as said, if you want to support the channel, you can do so by the means in the description. But that's it from me for now. Thank you for watching, and I'll be back.